a spirit fullest control. Confident living rights every wrong. Dynamic power helps me be strong. Confident living.
I'm Mike Costello, and I'd like to talk to you about changing the way that you think. And by changing the way that you think, we believe that you can change the quality of your life, that you can have a happier, fuller, and more fulfilling life. We believe that the way that we think about the problems of life, the challenges of life, and the things that happen to us determines the quality of what our life is really like. All of us have outside experiences in life. We all have to deal with our jobs and families, with conflict, with happiness and with joy, with sadness, and with great times of elation. But the reality is that regardless of what goes on in your life, it's what happens in you that matters, what happens inside you, the way you feel about the circumstances and situations. How many of you pay bills? We all pay bills, of course. We pay bills, some of us large, some of us small. We pay bills just to keep a roof over our heads, to keep the lights on. How many of you pay bills happily and with great joy? Probably most people would say they don't pay bills happily or with great joy. But the reality is that in paying bills, we have a great blessing. If we pay bills, it means that we have money for a house, a roof, for food. We get something very substantive for those bills. We get lights. We get people around us taken care of, our children fed. So it is important for us to view some of the negative influences of life not so negatively, but as positive experiences. And by changing the way that we think about them, we can change the quality of our life. A number of years ago, I was invited to a birthday party for a little girl here in the city. She was from a very poor family. And a number of people had gotten together to get her clothes and some things that she needed to go to school. This was a civic and religious group, and so the time had come when we all gathered at the home of this family, and it was a single mother and her little girl. The people brought gifts. They brought clothes, they brought dolls, they brought toys, they brought things that she would need to make her life happier in the midst of her seeming poverty, because she did come from a poor family. The little girl was so happy. She was so happy to have people around her. She accepted us so lovingly and openly. She didn't realize that she was poor. She didn't realize that she didn't have certain things. She knew, of course, that she didn't have certain things, but her life was not handicapped because of it. And we came in because we were asked to. Her mother knew we were coming. She knew we were coming, and there was great joy and happiness in the sharing that we had with her. But the mother was very uncomfortable, and the mother realized and knew that we were coming and was very grateful, but there wasn't the same level of comfort that there was with the little girl. The little girl took each package and held it in her hands, and there was happiness and joy. And as the little girl was happy and smiling and enjoying herself, I could see the mother, who was not quite as comfortable, who was really concerned about the environment and the people around, and wanted very desperately for her little girl to do the right thing. The mother was like us in life in many ways. The little girl was like every one of us when we come into this life experience. The little girl came in to this time of sharing, of receiving, with an open heart, with a happy heart, and with a joyful heart, putting aside the hurts of the past and the limit of the past and embracing the present moment. The mother had to deal with the present moment, thinking about it with sometimes negative thoughts. And she told the little girl each time she would open a package, "Tell this lady or this gentleman thank you. Tell them thank you." The little girl was so busy ripping open the packages that she didn't have time to tell us thank you. We knew of her thanks. We knew of her appreciation from just the joy of her sharing with us. In our lives, we are given gifts from God, just as we were in that small apartment giving gifts to this little girl. And God gives us gifts. And as He gives us gifts, not only physical gifts, not only the money that we have and the jobs and the special graces in the physical, but God gives us many, many graces in the spiritual, from the spiritual side of life. And God, like those of us who were in that room giving to that little girl, receive the thanks by seeing that the things that we have are used and appreciated. During the holidays or after a birthday or a party, perhaps, you've had the responsibility of writing thank you notes, and that's certainly a wonderful social grace, and it helps to give thanks to the people who have done something good and wonderful for you. But it is in the sharing and accepting of that which they gave you, it is in the use of that which they gave you, that you can give your greatest and most magnificent thanks. God gives us gifts in so many ways. God gives us ideas to deal with the circumstances and situations of life. God gives us direction in our lives by guiding us into a profession or a job. God gives us the thought to create the life that we have. And in the inflow of that which we receive from God, we are empowered and strengthened to share our lives and to have our prosperity needs met. Prosperity is a teaching that many people in New Thought are very familiar with. New Thought is our religious background. It is our philosophy of life. And so often the prosperity that we think of is a prosperity in the physical, that is having our physical needs met. And certainly the laws of abundance and prosperity, which are divine laws of the universe, work in a physical sense. But I don't want to talk about that today. What I want to talk to you about are the prosperity realities of this law of abundance when it comes to your thought process, to your mind, and to the needs of your life. Because if you have a prosperity of mind, if you have a prosperity and abundance of consciousness, no matter what happens in your life, you can be like this little girl. You can tear open the boxes. You can take that which comes to you from God, and you can use it in abundance and in magnificent ways. In order to have the abundance of physical needs or of spiritual inner needs, we need to open up an inflow and an outflow. That is, as there is room within, there are needs provided, and the needs from the outside come into our lives. If we have bills to pay and a checkbook, we know that if we have a job, that we'll get a paycheck, we can put that paycheck into the bank, we can write checks during a 2-week period or a week period, whatever the pay period is, and that during that period our needs will be met. As we write those checks, going out to the electric company, which employs people, going to the grocery store, which employs people, going to pay the bills and obligations, that money is flowing out and touching the lives of others. It creates a need for money to flow back into our lives. And that normal outflow and inflow works in a physical sense, but it also works, and it is imperative that we understand it, in a mental sense, in a spiritual sense, in an inner sense within our being. We believe that the consciousness that we have, that is the thoughts of our minds and the awareness that we have of who we are and what we are and how we are to deal with the circumstances and situations of our life, comes to us through a divine connection. We believe that divine mind, that is the mind of God, is connected to each of our physical minds, and that as a reaction of divine mind to physical mind, there is a consciousness or an awareness that takes place within our being. And that flow from the divine mind to our mind into our consciousness creates for us a prosperity of spirit, of inner being, that empowers us and allows us to deal with whatever circumstance or situation we have in our lives. When we cut off that connectiveness from divine mind, and when we don't allow that flowing power to come into us and go out of us, that process is short-circuited. And then our human mind begins to try to operate to deal with our life problems and with the circumstances and situations that take place. Just like that little girl, if we're willing to accept the gifts that God gives us, if we open them and embrace them with great joy and know that the prosperity of God's indwelling consciousness coming into our mind can strengthen us, empower us, guide us, and direct us, then we have nothing to worry about. It doesn't matter what happens in the outer. It doesn't matter if we lose a job, if a relationship ends. It doesn't matter if we don't have enough money to pay the bills, because that divine mind, that divine prosperity of consciousness will come into our minds, guide us and direct us to do what we need to do to open up a new and wonderful way of life. We need to be like that little girl. We need to accept the gifts that God has to give us in terms of consciousness and awareness. We need to expect those things as a natural process. We need to know that as we accept and receive the gifts that God gives us in terms of consciousness and mind, that we will be guided and directed to do whatever is best for us in any given circumstance or situation. I don't know what problem you face. I don't know what difficulty you have in your life. Perhaps you don't have any at this present moment. You have had difficulties in the past and challenges. You will have them in the future. That is part of the human process. And it is through that process that we wish to go and to walk with you so that we together can draw upon this divine consciousness and power to strengthen and empower each one of us to deal with whatever comes in life. Great example was Christ Jesus, the magnificent way shower. He was the personification of the perfect person in physical form. He was the example of what we are becoming and what we wish to be. In his life experience, he was much like you, much like me. He had a mother, a father, he had a trade, he had a job. He went into his ministry and into his life. In the midst of all of these experiences, some of them were good and some of them seemed to be bad. Some of them were happy and some of them were very sad. There were times of joy and there were times of great tears. But in his life, he knew of the prosperity consciousness, of the connectiveness, and the way that he put it was that it was the Father in him, it was God in him that guided and directed and empowered him to deal with the circumstances and situations. That message is as true for you as it was for him. And that message can empower and strengthen you, because what it says is that God's abundant conscious awareness and intelligence is flowing always down into your being, and that in that consciousness you will be guided, you will be directed, you will be shown. It doesn't mean that there won't be problems. It doesn't mean that there won't be tears. It doesn't mean that there won't be challenges. And it does mean that there will be, in the midst of each one of these circumstances and situations, a way for you to be directed and to be guided. And then it's up to you, it's up to me, to act upon the inspiration, the ideation, and the direction that we receive from this divine intelligence, from this consciousness that we say is so abundantly providing for all of us all of the time. We invite you to accept this consciousness, to expect it to be dynamic in your life, and that is the principle about which we speak here on this program. That is a principle that's fundamental to our teaching and to our fellowship. So we'd like to invite you to change your way of thinking, to embrace the concept of receiving in abundance the ideas and thoughts that you need from God. And in that, you'll be directed to deal with the circumstances and situations of your life in every way. Prayer is a major part of our ministry and a focus of what we do in our fellowship. We believe it's centering and it's empowering. We believe that it gathers us together and that it creates a vibration that touches us, that heals and renews and strengthens. So we'd invite you now to pause for a moment with us in a prayer. Eternal God, we open our hearts and our minds to the divine reality of your divine intelligence in every aspect of our lives. We know that this divine power is a source of reason, of direction, and of guidance. We accept it joyfully and happily. We invite your conscious awareness to flow into our human minds, to flood our consciousness with your divine presence and guidance. And as we accept this, we know that you will direct our ways and our thoughts. We know that you'll do this for us and for all people. In the name of faith, in the name of hope, in the name of love, amen.
That was a wonderful message about debt and responsibility. And I know that everyone is so afraid today. There's so much fear in the world. There's so much trepidation. And there are people losing their jobs. There are those people who have to do without. But we know that the laws of abundance are ever present. Could you just elaborate on that for a moment?
Well, the laws of abundance are ever present, and I think that when we talk about joyfully paying our bills, especially in today's environment, I think we do have something to be thankful for, because we see people, unfortunately, on the street corner and on the streets who don't have bills to pay.
Yes.
So we need to be thankful for that. And we do see many people who are unemployed, and this is a very difficult time from an economic standpoint. But there is abundance and there is supply in the physical as well as the spiritual, and directing that into our environment is a process of mind, and we can attract that which we need. It doesn't mean that there won't be times when there is limit and lack, but it does mean that in the midst of our limit and lack, that God can and will speak to us, guide us, and direct us to do new things. And I think that's one of the great difficulties of our time. We have so many people who now are being thrust into a time when they have to do something totally different for their physical sustenance, their job. We have so many people who were working in jobs that are no longer needed, and they have to be redirected. And so it is a spiritual principle that says to them, this is a change that's come into your life. Isn't it wonderful? You have this change. Now, what is it that God would have me do with my life? If I'm an engineer that can't find a job, what is it that God would have me do? And God will direct. That consciousness will direct that person into something else. They may not be able to do what they did before.
But they have the opportunity to be adaptable, and that to be adaptable is part of our lesson in life.
A great lesson in our lives. Being adaptable is probably one of the most difficult things for us, because we think if we're going to be adaptable to a situation that we have to do something. And in fact, we don't have to do anything except what we're guided and directed to do. We have to do something, but it's not of our doing. We don't have to come up with the solution ourselves. We have to allow the Spirit to speak to us and through us, and to guide us into what we should and what we must do.
Well, we can look to we hear all these complaints about the government and how they keep spending, spending, spending. And so we can take a lesson from our own book there and know that we just have to conserve. And if we don't spend more than we have coming in, then we're not going to be in trouble. So sometimes it's really hard for people to cut down when they've had lots of funds coming in. But that's part of the adaptability, is learning what our own resources truly are.
And the consequences of our actions and our thoughts.
Yes.
And so if we lived from a consciousness of abundance, but we spend ourselves beyond that level without the inflow and the source to direct ourselves to earn that additional income, then we have to pay for the consequences.
Yes.
And I think that's what happens on a global basis. But it's a great equalizing process, because the prosperity and the abundance teachings are there and they operate, even though there are periods of time when they appear not to. And they are universal laws. They are in place.
And part of the adaptability is finding out what we can do and doing it before we lose our job, then to know where we're going from there, making plans in advance and adjusting our way of thinking that, no, we're not going to cling too long to any one thing, like to an old job that's no longer going to be there, to old ways of thinking that's no longer going to be there. And the resource is within us if we just look within and see that the source is God, and we, as a part of God, have access to that source at all times.
Exactly. Very important for us to understand, but letting go of those old ideas and not coveting so closely the way of life that we have, but being willing to let it go if it is an appointed time to let go of that job or of that position. And also to operate from the standpoint of having our needs met. Now, we determine to a large extent what our needs are, but abundance is not, and prosperity have not necessarily to do with accumulation as much as circulation. And so if we choose to circulate a lot of financial benefits and resources, then that is a choice that we'll create. But if we don't circulate or allow that inflow and outflow to take place, but rather just accumulate, then there's a stagnation that takes place. That's in the physical, talking about money, and of course it works, but it also happens in the spiritual. And so that consciousness of prosperity and abundance needs to be at the very core of our being, and that is to know that our needs will be met and to allow the inflow of what we need in terms of spiritual strength, in terms of intellectual knowledge, guidance, and direction, so that the outward appearances of jobs and cash and bills paid is taken care of really because of what's driven from the spiritual principle within. So I believe we need a prosperity consciousness and an abundance consciousness before we ever try to manifest it in the outer, because it can be manifested in the outer. And if it's manifested in the outer without a change of consciousness on the inner, there will be a period of equalization, and the outer will balance with the inner, and that's a very natural process that takes place, and it takes place from time to time in personal lives, in national economies, and in global economies.
I hear you saying that we have to know that God is there for us all the time, that we can look to God at any moment. How wonderful it is we can go home to God at any moment in our minds and in our thinking, but we have to accept the changes and be responsible for the changes that come into our lives, and planning ahead and making those changes, but living in the now at the same time.
It is an issue of responsibility. Everything is an issue of responsibility and choice. And we are responsible not to God, we are responsible to the laws. And the laws don't change. And so as we are responsible for our actions and we accept responsibility, then we accept the consequences of our actions, of thought and act, and then our lives must be adapted accordingly.
And yet there are those teachers who teach prosperity consciousness, prosperity so strongly, and yet very often those same teachers go down, they fall, because just thinking of prosperity is a hollow shell. It doesn't do the work. It isn't sufficient. We have to have the prosperity consciousness, but know that there's a deeper inner meaning to life, to our responsibility, and to our relation to God, the whole. And then we don't have that hollow shell which will crumble at the slightest touch, which so often happens with people who teach prosperity consciousness.
So often in our movement, in New Thought churches and fellowships and centers, we see prosperity and abundance taught from the standpoint of the financial or the material, and that is very valid. We also see a lot of fundamentalist and traditional teachers and ministries now teaching prosperity consciousness, and it's wonderful. But it is that which takes place inside that's really the important issue, and so that's why we build upon that consciousness of prosperity from within, and then let the outer manifest from what is within.
It's when we're taking responsibility for our own debts, for our own needs, and not living beyond our means, but just living thoughtfully and planning thoughtfully and living then according to our own plan, that we're able to avoid the hollow shell of just prosperity. And that would be true of any facet of spiritual truth, that if we can't just latch on to one facet and live in the physical sense in that way. It has to go all the way through mind, body, and spirit.
That's key. It has to be mind, body, spirit, and then the physical is aligned with the spiritual and is aligned with the intellect or with the mind of God, and then magnificent things happen. It's much like healing ministries, and you know we believe very strongly in divine healing.
Yeah.
And we pray for the sick. We have services for that purpose, and New Thought churches and centers are very dynamic healing ministries. But the reality is that people get sick. No matter how good they are, they get sick. What causes that sickness we can debate and talk about for a long time, but even very good people get sick. And very good people do not necessarily receive a healing or a curing of that illness. And it's the same way with prosperity. We have times in our lives when we are particularly prosperous on the outer, but circumstances and situations, vibrations take place over which we have some control or no control. And so our role as children of God is to simply accept where we are and the condition in which we find ourselves, and then connect to just what we were talking about a few minutes ago, that divine intelligence, so that we say to God, not, why did this happen? Why am I unemployed? Why don't I have money? Instead, what do I do now that I'm unemployed? What do I do now that I don't have money? What do I do? And what we do is begin the inner work of prosperity consciousness by connecting that individual with divine mind through meditation, through prayers, through centering, and then empower that person to be guided and directed as God would have them be, and that is abundantly provided for, meaning their needs will be met, and not that they will accumulate necessarily, but that their needs will be met, whatever those are decided to be by that person.
As above, so below. As the microcosm, so the macrocosm. And knowing that it's all there for us, we have to reach out and use our own initiative.
Choice.
Yeah.
Choice and responsibility. We can't give it over to God and expect God to do everything. God's done all that dynamic power is going to do for us. It created the laws, watches us, and keeps everything in order. Now life is up to us, and the choice of life is always up to us.
That's our free will. God gave us every abundance possible in this world, and it's our free will as to how we use that abundance or misuse it, how we pay our debts or not pay them. And it's a wonderful thing if that we have the resources available to us.
And the resources to give.
Yes.
And that's the key, I think, to prosperity and abundance, not only of the physical, but of the spiritual. We give of our money. It's not enough to give of our money to buy a house and a car and to deal with the physical needs that we have. We need to use our money for good. We need to give it to people and good and noble purposes. We also need to give of our thoughts and give of our time and give of our spiritual being, because as we give freely of ourselves, of our abundance, then prosperity is open to us. And we have a big challenge in order to be able to do that, to be willing to give.
There's a very pregnant phrase, we give that we may get, that we may give again. And when we take that into our consciousness and live from that point, it makes a big difference in life. It makes a big difference in the lives of the people around us, too, because we're giving to them and we're accepting. I know I've heard it said you have to learn to receive as graciously as you give.
Absolutely. And that cycle of inflow and outflow, the cycle of coming in, going out, coming in, going out, and that sharing process is important to abundance and to prosperity. What we've been talking about today is a way for you to create abundance and prosperity in your life and to live confidently, and we invite you to do that, and we would like you to remember to believe in yourself because God does.
Confident living, banner of might, comes from the Spirit with glorious light. Confident living cleanses my soul, giving the Spirit fullest control. Confident living rights every wrong. Dynamic power helps me be strong. Confident living comforts my heart. From such a blessing I can't depart.